He broke into my apartment while I was sleeping. He didn't know I hadn't lived there for real in 8 months. My name isn't important yet. What matters is that my stepbrother thought he knew exactly who I was. A glorified data entry clerk. A woman who got lucky with a government job title that sounded impressive at Thanksgiving but didn't mean anything real. Someone who cried when he screamed at her and apologized when he shoved her into a doorframe. That was the version of me he had stored in his head. He'd been operating off that file for years, and he never once thought to update it. Let me back up. I grew up in a house where love was conditional, and conditions were always changing. My mother remarried when I was 9. My stepfather was not a violent man, but he was a weak one. And weak men in positions of authority do enormous damage over time. He had a son, my stepbrother, 3 years older than me, and from the first week, we lived under the same roof. That boy made it his personal mission to remind me that I didn't belong there. Not in the house. Not in the family. Not in any room he happened to walk into. I learned to be small. I learned to take up less space, make less noise, want less. I got good grades because school was somewhere he wasn't. I went to college on a scholarship because I needed a reason to leave. I came back as little as possible. And when I did come back, I smiled at my stepfather's dinners and helped my mother with dishes and pretended that nothing had ever been wrong. It was easier. It was survival. My stepbrother never left home. He didn't need to. My stepfather kept funding him the failed bar venture, the sports betting debts, the used car that sat in the driveway for 2 years without ever being driven. My stepfather called it investing in family. My mother called it love. I called it what it was. Privately. To no one. After college, I got a job. Then I got a better job. Then I got a job I'm not allowed to describe in detail at dinner parties. Which meant that at every family gathering for the next several years, I was introduced as working in federal data analysis. And my stepbrother would laugh. In that particular way, he had not loud enough to be called out. Just loud enough to be heard and say something like, "She counts spreadsheets for the government." Very impressive. And everyone would smile. And I would smile. And I would file it away. I filed a lot of things away. About 2 years ago, I was assigned to a regional team that required me to relocate temporarily. I kept my apartment. I sublet it to a colleague. But on paper, I maintained it as my primary residence. And I came back roughly once a month to handle mail and keep up appearances. To anyone looking, including my family, I still lived there. I still came home for holidays. I still sat at the same table and ate the same food, and listened to my stepbrother talk about how the government was rotten and everyone who worked for it was either a fool or a criminal. He had no idea. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday in March. I was back in my apartment for a long weekend, catching up on sleep, when my neighbor texted me. She'd seen someone she didn't recognize trying my door handle the night before. She described him. I knew immediately who it was. I called my mother. She said my stepbrother had been asking about me. About my apartment specifically. He'd mentioned to her, casually, that he'd heard I had a nice setup now. That he was curious what I was actually doing with my money. My mother relayed this, the way she relayed everything as information with no opinion attached, as if she were a news anchor, reporting on a country she'd never visited. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat on my kitchen floor for about 4 minutes. And then I did what I always do. I got to work. Here's what most people don't know about working in federal compliance and investigative support. For as long as I have you develop a very particular relationship with documentation, you stop thinking of it as a burden. You start thinking of it as a language. Every interaction leaves a record. Every record tells a story. The question is never whether the story exists, it's whether you're ready to read it. I had 4 cloud-connected cameras installed in my apartment within 48 hours. Motion activated. Encrypted. Backed up automatically to a secure server I access through work channels. I upgraded my door lock to a smart system that logs every entry attempt with a timestamp. I told my neighbor, the one who texted me that I'd been having trouble with a persistent ex and asked if she'd be willing to keep an eye out. She said yes without hesitation. She was 71 years old and had the sharpest memory of anyone I'd ever met. Then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. My stepbrother had a gambling problem that had recently become a gambling crisis. I knew this not because he told me, but because my stepfather had called me in February, one of the rare times he called just me, not through my mother, and asked, in a very careful voice, if I had any savings, I might be willing to contribute to a family situation. I asked him to be specific. He wasn't. I said I couldn't help with something I didn't understand. He said he'd handle it. He sounded like a man who had been saying he'd handle things for 30 years and had handled none of them. What I pieced together later, through my mother and through my stepbrother's own eventual confession on camera, I'll get to that, was this. He owed a significant amount of money to people who were not patient. He had already exhausted my stepfather's generosity. He had sold what he owned. He had borrowed from friends who were no longer friends. And he had decided, at some point in the weeks before that Tuesday in March, that I was his next resource. Not alone. A resource? He'd told someone, a mutual acquaintance I heard from later, that his stepsister had government money and a nice apartment full of equipment, and that she wouldn't even notice if some of it went missing. He broke in on a Thursday night in April. I wasn't there. I was in the middle of a 10-day stretch back at my posted location. But my cameras were there. My lock log was there. My neighbor was there. He got in through a window he'd apparently assessed on his previous attempt. He spent 23 minutes in my apartment. The cameras caught all of it: his face, his hands, what he touched, what he took. He walked through my living room with the kind of ease that told me he'd planned this, that he'd thought it through, that he was not afraid of me at all. He went through my desk. He took a laptop, an older personal one. I'd intentionally left out. Because I had a feeling, because I always have a feeling, and a small external drive that contained absolutely nothing of value. Because I'd swapped it out the week before. He stood in the middle of my living room for a moment before he left, looking around, and the camera caught his face clearly in that moment. He looked satisfied. He had no idea he'd just handed me everything I needed. I filed a report within the hour. I had the footage. I had the lock log showing forced entry. I had my neighbor's written statement. She'd heard the window and called it in to a non-emergency line before she even texted me. Bless her. So there was a time-stamped record there too. I forwarded everything to the relevant contacts. I also quietly flagged, through proper channels, that the individual involved had previously made statements about federal employees and government property that warranted attention. I was careful. I was precise. I was not angry. Not on paper. On paper, I was simply a federal employee documenting a burglary committed by a known individual. What happened next took about 6 weeks. My stepbrother was picked up at my stepfather's house on a Wednesday afternoon. I know this because my mother called me, crying. Within minutes, she said there must be a mistake. She said he would never. She said I had always had it out for him, ever since we were children. That I'd never accepted him as family. That this was my way of punishing her for remarrying. I listened to all of it. I didn't argue. I said, Mom, I have him on camera inside my apartment. He took my property. I didn't have a choice. She said, You always have a choice. And she hung up. That phone call hurt more than anything my stepbrother ever did to me directly. I want to be honest about that. I sat with it for a long time. My stepfather called an hour later. He was calmer. But underneath the calm was something I recognized, the particular tone of a man who has spent decades managing consequences and has just run out of runway. He asked if there was any way to handle this privately. I asked him what that meant. He said, He's family. And family works things out. I said, He committed a federal offense and I have it documented 6 ways from Sunday. There is no private version of this. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Your mother is very upset. I said I knew. He said, I hope you understand what you're doing to this family. I said, I understand exactly what I'm doing. That was the last time we spoke before the formal proceedings. My stepbrother, to his credit, if that's the right word, did not try to deny the footage. His attorney apparently advised him that there was no angle there, that the evidence was too clean. What he tried instead was context. He told investigators that I had told him he could come by and borrow equipment, that we had a standing arrangement, that this was a misunderstanding between family members that had been escalated unfairly. Nobody believed him. I had call logs showing no contact between us in 14 months. I had text records. I had the neighbor. I had the lock log showing forced entry on a window, not a door. And I had a quiet note in the file, added by someone above my pay grade, that observed the items taken, included what appeared to be government-adjacent equipment, which added a layer to the proceedings that made my stepbrother's attorney visibly unhappy at every subsequent meeting. Here is the part that matters most. The part I think about when I'm having a hard day and need to remember why I do things the way I do them. 3 weeks into the process, my stepbrother requested a meeting. His attorney, my representation, neutral ground. I agreed. He walked in looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. He sat down across from me, and for a moment he just looked at his hands. Then he looked at me. And I saw something I had never seen on his face before in my entire life. Not remorse. Not exactly. But recognition. The look of a person who has spent years building a story about someone and has just been confronted with evidence that the story was wrong. He said, "What do you actually do?" I said, "It doesn't matter what I do. It matters what you did." He said, I didn't think there would be." He stopped. Started again. "I didn't think it would be like this." I said, "I know. That's the point." He said, "The family's going to fall apart over this." I said, "The family was already apart. You just weren't paying attention." He looked at me for a long moment after that. I don't know what he was looking for. Whatever it was, I don't think he found it. He nodded once, slowly, and looked back at his hands. The settlement of charges took another month. My stepbrother pled to a reduced count. He was required to make restitution, complete a substantial period of supervised release, and satisfy some additional conditions related to the federal flag on the case that his attorney negotiated down from something considerably more serious. My stepfather drained another portion of whatever was left in his reserves to cover legal fees. My mother stopped calling. I went back to work. I finished my rotation. I came home, my real home, in July. And I stood in my living room and looked at the cameras I'd installed and thought about how long I had been preparing for something I hoped would never happen. My neighbor brought me a plant when she saw my light on. She said she was glad I was back. She said, "That young man had very bad energy." I told her she was right. She said, "I knew it the first time I saw him. Some people carry trouble with them like luggage." I said I'd noticed the same thing. She squeezed my hand and went back to her apartment. And I stood in my doorway for a minute in the evening air. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like the apartment was actually mine. My mother and I are not in contact right now. I don't know if that will change. I used to think reconciliation was always the right goal. That distance from family was a wound that needed healing no matter what. I don't think that anymore. Some distances are protection. Some silences are the most honest thing two people can offer each other. My stepfather sent me a message 2 months after everything concluded. It was short. It said I should have done better by you. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. I read it 4 times. I haven't responded yet. I'm not sure what response, if any, is the right one. I'm thinking about it. My stepbrother does not contact me. Under the terms of his supervised release, he's not supposed to. But even beyond that, I think something shifted in him after that meeting. I don't know if it shifted toward anything good. I hope it did. Not for his sake, or not only for his sake, but because people who don't shift tend to come back around. And I have been doing this long enough to know that I would rather not have to do it again. What I want you to take from this, if you're sitting somewhere feeling small, feeling like the people around you have you accurately filed, like they've got you figured out and the figure they've got isn't worth much, is this: they're working from old data. They haven't updated the file. And that's not your problem to correct ahead of time. You don't have to announce what you are or what you're capable of. You don't have to defend yourself preemptively. You just have to keep documenting, keep building, keep being, quietly and precisely, exactly who you are, because the moment they decide to underestimate you in a way that leaves a record, and they will, eventually, they always do, you will be ready. I was ready.